Yes, it doesn't matter how good your ideas are, unless the market's right, and unless the people are interested enough to buy it, it just won't go. Invention isn't enough.
Bicycle, bicycle, bicycle. I want to ride my bicycle, bicycle, bicycle. I want to ride my bicycle. I want to ride my bike. I want to ride my bicycle. I want to ride it where I like.
John Pinkerton, historic cycle enthusiast, past president of the Southern Veteran Cycle Club. He's going to help us examine bicycle evolution in the 19th century to discover what lies behind innovation. Also in the programme, David Duffield, another bike enthusiast and a marketing manager with wide experience of the British cycle industry. He'll tell us about 20th century trends and forces that have influenced design and innovation. And you're going to see lots of bicycles in action, plus some archive film to show some key developments in cycle components and bicycle design. I'm going to use these developments to illustrate what I see as three major phases of bicycle evolution. In the block text, I've called these phases divergence, that's radical innovation, convergence, or evolutionary development, and divergence, radical innovation again. So that's divergence, convergence, and divergence. Let's begin then in the 19th century with the divergent phase, which led from this velocipede, or bone shaker, of the late 1860s, through an amazing variety of often strange designs, as you'll see in a moment, to the familiar diamond frame safety bicycle, this 1893 Swift, for example. Why was there so much variety in design in the last century? At Arbury Hall, near Nuneaton, I got John Pinkerton to demonstrate using some of the most significant machines of the period.
The velocipede was probably the first real bicycle because it had direct drive to the front wheel through these cranks and pedals. The design of the frame was a very heavy wrought iron, and the wheels were taken from carriage technology with wooden spokes and hubs, but had iron tyres to protect them against the road wear. The only bit of comfort that was afforded was this spring saddle. The bone shaker with its heavy frame gave quite an uncomfortable ride. The road shocks were transmitted directly through the handlebars. The slight advantage of the sprung saddle soon was lost because the small wheel meant that you had to turn your pedals fairly quickly to get anywhere at all. Overall, not a very good machine to ride. The aerial, with its wire spokes and the ability to tension these spokes through this rod here, enabled the manufacturers to produce a much larger wheel. Subsequently, the rider could get much further with one revolution of the pedals. The rider also had the advantage of this rubber tyre, which made it a slightly more comfortable machine to ride. But these wheels were still not big enough, and here we see a much larger wheel. The size of the wheel, incidentally, depends on the size of the rider's legs. Fine points of this machine show the tangentially spoking, the tubular forks and tubular frame, which meant that it was quite lightweight. So here we go with what is probably the ultimate in high-wheel bicycle design. The larger wheel of this machine meant that I travelled much further with one revolution of the pedals. The view is wonderful. The drawback, of course, is that the precarious position of me over the centre of the wheel can easily lead to a tumble over the front. A very nasty experience, which I don't wish to demonstrate. Well, there's no brake on this one. Tiny brake. What an exciting machine, and terribly dangerous as well. With the tricycle, we've got a much more stable machine with its three wheels, Still using the large size wheel, but with the steering at the rear, operated by rack and pinion, the machine is more manageable. A much more comfortable seat and a handbrake for the steep downhills. And finally, the next step, the chain drive, which meant that you didn't have the problem of correcting the steering of the front wheel as your pedals pushed it out of line. Brakes were applied to both wheels instead of just one, and again alleviated the danger and the possibility of a header. The wider garden seat saddle also gave the rider a much better position, and once again this added to the safety of the whole outfit. This most unusual machine, the Bates Shadow, was very similar to the Lawson bicyclette. Its rear chain drive and low saddle position made it a safe machine, but very, very difficult to steer. And its unusual looks would have caused it to be laughed off the road by the other cyclists and road users of the period. It didn't catch on. The Kangaroo, like a high wheeler, but of course, as you can see, much smaller. And this was affected by the chain drive to the front wheel. You've still got the same distance with one revolution of the pedals, but because it was smaller, your weight was lower down, you could get much further forward and get your effort into the pedals. Quite a pleasant machine to ride, and certainly nowhere near as dangerous as the high wheeler. But unfortunately, because of the difficulties of the chain drive, poor bearings, it soon wore out and was superseded by the cross-frame safety and subsequently the Rover diamond frame. The compact cross-frame safety, with its geared-up chain drive, produced a much smaller wheel, which was much more manageable. But ultimately, the Rover safety produced the diamond frame, which was subsequently going to affect all bicycle production. This really is a safe machine to ride. Good control of the steering, which is not affected now by the pedals on the front wheel as they drive the back wheel. Much lower riding position, so if you need to get to the ground, no real problem. See up the road. Ta-da! The ultimate in bicycle design. Pneumatic tyres, geared chain drive, wide controllable handlebars, an extremely nice and comfortable saddle. Even mud guards to protect you from the road dirt. This was the machine that led to all current production, and a very nice machine it is too.
John restores historic cycles in his own home. This has given him a good understanding of bicycle evolution. Why did the classic diamond frame bike take so long to evolve? I asked him first who designed early cycles.
Well, I certainly think that they weren't the engineers of the time, the engineers that were involved in engineering as such. They were inventors, they were people who weren't prepared to accept the situation as it was. They wanted something different, they were looking at new ideas.
Why do you think we had to go through the development of the high wheeler and the Kangaroo and various types of tricycles before we got to the diamond frame, which seems such a simple machine?
One of the many reasons, I think, was that people were satisfied with their lot. There was no push by the market to have new things. They were quite happy with that fad and fancy of that particular time. They put up with the dangers of falling off the machine. The people who didn't like to ride high wheelers had the facility of the tricycle, which in itself had got the chain drive there. But some of them just couldn't get the thing together. And when they did try chain drives, like we see in the Lawson's bicyclette and that Bates Shadow, they were so unusual and so alien, although they kept the big wheel to the high wheeler, that people just wouldn't take to them. And I think that good ideas are only as good as the market or the time will allow. If the market isn't right and if the people aren't interested in that particular time, it doesn't matter how good your idea is, it just won't sell, it won't do anything.
And what kind of people actually bought and rode the early cycles?
Well, certainly people who'd got a lot of time on their hands, people who'd got money and didn't need to go into business for work, people with land and property and this sort of thing. And the early bicycles were used more as an entertainment and a sort of a jolly pastime than a particular mode of transport to get from A to B.
With the advent of the diamond frame and the pneumatic tyre in the 1890s, there was a huge boom in the popularity of cycling.
If you were anybody in the period, you had to have a bicycle. You had to be seen in the park with your bicycle. But leaving out the fashion side of it, it was very exciting. The market was right. There were enough people producing machines with the right sort of qualities. They were safe, they were easy to ride, and they were also made for ladies as well as gentlemen. Now, this is very important. Unfortunately, because of the cost of the machines at that time, only the relatively rich people could afford to own bicycles. However, the results of it, years later, when the fashion died out, because like all fashions, people get tired, there was something else they wanted to go and do. But it meant that there was a capacity to manufacture bicycles relatively cheaply. And certainly by the end of the First World War, just before the First World War, bicycles were available at the right sort of prices for most people to own.
And what was best manufactured and sold was this kind of machine. This is a 1982 Rally Popular, but it's almost identical to one they were making back in 1905. And the only real difference between it and the 1893 Swift are some new and improved components, notably the 3-speed Sturmey Archer gear and an all-steel frame construction. By 1895, therefore, bicycle design had converged onto the standard diamond frame configuration. So, in this convergent phase, which lasted up to 1960, there was little change in basic design. Attention turned instead to mass production of low-cost machines. But at the same time, components, materials and accessories were gradually refined to produce lightweight sports bikes, like this 1930s French racing bike with an all-aluminium frame. This doesn't mean that inventors and designers weren't active. Many novel cycle designs were produced in the 1920s and 30s. The French recumbent vélo car, for example. But the time wasn't right, and they were banned from cycle sport. Few ever became innovations. Besides sport, what influenced the development of bicycles in this convergent period? One record-holding tricyclist who's worked for many famous British cycle firms is David Duffield. I asked him first why cycling became so popular between the wars.
Two things really. After the Depression, people were getting back to work and they needed transport, and there was a great surge of understanding of manufacturing en masse, and that got people on the road. They got cheap transport, 2 bob down, 2 bob a week, and they got to and from work on their bicycles, and that took us really up to the Second World War.
After the war, people wanted to get back on bikes, and cycling continued to be every man's transport, right up to the 1950s.
Well, the decline in the use of bicycles in the 1950s, as people became more affluent and could then take other forms of transport, say to and from work, they're going by bus or by train, and also they began to buy motor cars to go to and from work. So there was that falling away, and it became a non-new thing to do in the late 50s.
By the early 1960s, the British cycle industry was in decline. Sales were falling. There were no new products to stimulate new markets. The industry contracted and firms merged. It was at this point that Alex Moulton introduced his novel small wheel bicycle and started off the second divergent phase. David Duffield was Moulton's commercial manager in the early 1960s. I asked him why it had taken so long for a major innovation in bicycle design to happen.
Well, partly because of the declined industry, we had to wait for something new to come along when everybody had virtually cleared away the dust and sat down and looked at the business afresh. It was survival. That was a big thing for the British industry. Alex Moulton had a different job to do. He was an engineer, he was an innovator, he was able to look at a blank white piece of paper, and that's where he started from. He had no preconceived notions about bicycles. He just felt the bike of that time was wrong, and he set about changing it.
It was a question of studying what was wrong with the existing bike. And I felt that the riding position was correct, the driving by chain was correct. The thing that was quite wrong was the retention of wheels of the enormous size. I resolved that 14 inches or 16 inches, provided one had suspension, was an entirely satisfactory and suitable wheel size. And that led up to this new form of bicycle with its equal suitability for a man or a woman and the possibility of carrying luggage. And that is, in a nutshell, is the evolution of the thinking behind this new form of the bicycle.
Well, I think the impact of the Moulton on the long-term design of bikes has been absolutely astronomical. And when people sit down and write the history in many years to come, they will see what it did. It changed the standard diamond frame with 26 or 27-inch wheels into something quite new. Because once the small wheels were accepted and Raleigh had to come in and make their 16-inch wheel answer to the Moulton, they then followed on with the 20-inch wheel version, which is the family bike that is used extensively since then, and from that other things developed. Even the chopper could not have been made without the Moulton bike. It was introduced in the early 70s, and immediately it latched on to the kids because the kids could see here something, and affluence had come back in as well, and people were beginning to buy presents for kids, and perhaps they hadn't had bicycles themselves when they were young, and they started to buy bikes like the chopper, which appealed to the children. That really put the cycle industry back up again on the upward curve, and the chopper brought in behind it an enormous interest in light types of bikes for fun riding.
Take the fun bicycle. Give it a strengthened frame, knobbly tyres and straight forks, and you've got a whole new market, BMX. Bicycle motocross was a very popular sport in America in the 1970s and was brought over to Britain in the 80s by David Duffield.
The industry is promoting BMX at the moment because there is a problem in the future market for maybe the next 5-7 years. This prime group of under 16-year-olds, 5 to 16 as such, there's a decline in the birth rate between 1976 and 1986 of 1 million children. So your potential market is going down. And one needed to go out and stimulate that market. BMX, I think, gets children interested in cycling. Once they've been used to riding over the rough ground, then perhaps they will want to ride on 10-speed sports bikes and go further afield as they get older.
Go!
Brighton, 1981. The Aspro Clear speed trials. Not only had the new interest in cycling in the 1970s led to increased sales of sports bicycles, but it also led American enthusiasts and engineers to design various novel types of cycle, including streamlined, recumbent, human-powered vehicles developed for racing purposes.
Next to run. This is by the University of Warwick. No, this is... And there you go with 7 on the front ball.
This turned out to be another interest of David Duffield's.
So that's within the range anyway. Certainly the CX 2000 set's got 40 tooths in, so we get that all right for you from the supplier.
He helped Tony Webb and Dave Hughes with the development of their recumbent streamliner called Dark Horse. Would we soon be seeing these novel machines on our roads?
I'm not entirely certain that we're going to see it in the near future. It's probably 10, even 15 years away from us, because there are some problems in those machines going on the road today. They're only about 3 feet off the ground. They go very fast indeed. They can easily do 50 miles an hour on a dual carriageway, nice smooth road, and the traffic isn't expecting them. But I believe they can be developed, and possibly some form of electrical storage system being added to these machines, and people can ride them to and from work.
So it may be some time before we see a machine like the record-breaking American Vector on the streets of Britain. Meanwhile, what other developments did David Duffield envisage?
I see a lot of developments in bicycle design before we get to the recumbent machines, and those will be basically around the use of special materials, lightweight aluminium for instance, perhaps more plastic being used in bicycles, but the configuration will change slightly. I think the 20-inch wheel bicycle will maybe the type of machine that would lend itself to other materials being used. The trouble is with using other materials is the investment cost in, say, making a plastic frame is very, very high indeed.
Well, one Swedish firm did invest £5 million in developing this bike, which is made almost entirely of plastics. It was launched in 1982, but to me, it looks rather like the 1860s bone shaker. Although the classic diamond frame is still with us, and no doubt it'll continue to be made in large numbers, the bike is still evolving and changing. There's almost as much variety in design today as there was in the last century, like this folding bike, and this recumbent design from America, reminiscent of the 1930s recumbents, which never caught on. OK, let me try to sum up. First we saw the 19th century divergent phase, as cycle designers attempted by trial and error to develop a safe, efficient and comfortable machine. Then we had a convergent phase with one basic design, the diamond frame safety being mass-produced for the ordinary user and refined for sporting purposes. Finally, a second divergent phase starting in the 1960s with the molten bike. Today, inventors are interested in all sorts of bicycle types, while manufacturers are interested in new markets, for example BMX. But, as in the past, to succeed in innovation, invention is not enough. The product and the market have both got to be right. So, is invention any more likely to lead to innovation today?
I think there could be some acceptance in the 1980s of change of bicycle design rather than in the 1930s when it was virtually looked upon as a bit of a gimmick, because there is this problem of finding alternative forms of transport. At that time it wasn't a very serious piece of development at all, but a lot more people are now interested in finding other forms of bicycle design, and I don't think the game's finished yet by any means.
I'm really looking forward to seeing what the development of the bicycle is going to bring in the next 30 years, because I think that it is on the move.